Really?
Go ahead. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Let's go ahead and kick off this discussion since we have some great panelists and a lot to talk about. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Bromley, and I am with the Council for Global Equality, which is a advocacy human rights organization here in Washington. We're actually a coalition of 30 member organizations, and together we encourage a U.S. human rights policy and a U.S. development agenda that responds to unique challenges facing LGBT and intersex communities around the world. And so from a public policy perspective, I really understand and value data on that sort of gives us information on the realities and the lives of LGBT and intersex people around the world. And so I'm delighted to help moderate and kick off this discussion today on filling the data gap on sexual and gender minorities. And I'll introduce our panelists in a moment. But it's particularly appropriate that we're having this discussion today because this week is Transgender Day of Remembrance. And while we have often been critical of our Secretary of State for not speaking out on human rights issues, he did in fact issue a statement yesterday for Transgender Day of Remembrance. And it actually does help set, I think, the tone and the discussion today. So I just want to read a little part of that statement from the Secretary of State, who says that transgender individuals and their advocates, along with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and intersex persons, are facing increasing physical attacks and arbitrary arrests in many parts of the world. On this Transgender Day of Remembrance, the United States remains committed to advancing the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons. So, in that context of increasing violence and discrimination, there are some real challenges to collecting data on LGBT and intersex individuals. So let's meet some of the experts who have been addressing this data collection conundrum, and we'll kick off the discussion. So right here we have Sandy James, who is a research director with the National Center for Transgender Equality. Next we have Phil Crehan, who is the director of the International Division of the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, and has also spent a lot of time on data collection at the World Bank in his previous job. We have Chloe Schwenke, the director of the Global Program on Violence, Rights, and Inclusion here at the International Center for Research on Women in this lovely office. So thank you for hosting us. And Ty Cobb, who's the director of the Global Program at Human Rights Campaign. So, Chloe, since you're our host, I'd love to maybe kick it off with you.
Sure.
Maybe if you could just, particularly, in this week on Transgender Day of Remembrance, talk about sort of what we know and what we don't know in terms of the data out there on the lives of trans people around the world, and then more generally the different sets of data that we're going to be talking about, from kind of human rights and violence-driven data versus public health data and economic development empowerment data. What are these different sets of data, and how do they relate or not relate?
Well, thanks, Mark. There's a variety of sets of data, but not very many, and not very deep in most cases when you're looking at the international situation. Of course, HIV/AIDS data is fairly robust, and that's fairly comprehensive in looking at the whole LGBTQI community. It's only recently, though, that they really started focusing in on differentiating between men who have sex with men and transgender people. I am trans, and we really weren't recognized as a population until relatively recently in that data collection stream. But of course, there's catches with that kind of information. There's stigma attached to identifying a population with the disease, and it's important as the health ramifications are of making sure that key populations, as they're called in that context, are looked at and addressed and understood. There's real limitations on that as well. Other data comes from the human rights community, and I'm sure Ty can speak more to that, but that's mostly in the form of narratives, of anecdotal data, very solid anecdotal data, not just, thin stuff, but really important stories that are coming from all around the world. I formerly worked at Freedom House and the Dignity for All program there. That's 15 different countries that are supporting the collection of that data and the response to those emergency situations. And the stories are horrific. They're really bad. But again, it's very anecdotal. It's just an incident, and it gets logged, and there's a response, and that's the end of it. There isn't a great deal of robust empirical data, qualitative or quantitative, about any of the letters, LGBTQI, or how many other letters you add to that. And that's a problem. It's a problem because so much of the significant funding that people who are excluded, and certainly sexual and gender minorities are very excluded people in terms of countries' development, they really are precluded from benefiting from development funding. They just can't get there, and development funders who don't have any reason not to support them have one very important reason not to support them, and that is there's no baseline. There's no way to measure results from. For people who are spending significant sums of money, and I'm talking about USAIDs and DFIDs and World Banks and others, they're accountable for that money. They need to show results, and there's no baseline to measure from. The money does not flow. In my work, I travel and have for years all around the world and meet with LGBTQI people everywhere I go, and of course they want laws and attitudes to change, they want policies to change, they want a job. They want a house. They want to be able to, be able to travel. They want to just have a life and hope for a future. And for so many of them in countries, particularly with my population, the trans population, they're invisible. Their countries do not recognize their new names. They certainly don't recognize their new gender identities. They can't get a job. They can't buy an airline ticket. They can't do so many things that others take for granted. And that's a huge problem. Where's the data? Where's the data? How can we address that substantially? And it's a challenge to find funders to actually help us get that data right now. And I think that's the biggest obstacle right now, is to get, for what is relatively a very small population, to get that data collected and maintained in a safe way and ethical way.
Well, so maybe looking at some of the data that exists here in the US, since we are one of the countries that has relatively more experience in collecting data than certainly a number of developing countries. Human Rights Campaign has been collecting data for quite a while, and you straddle both some of the rights violations, looking at hate crimes and other issues, as well as economic empowerment and health data. Can you kind of tell us where we are here in this country on data collection?
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about really the data that we work with as an organization. And Chloe's right. One of the main things we work with is data around stories, the narrative, and telling those stories and anecdotes in a different way that the development community is able to work. A credible anecdote can set up a full advocacy campaign at a place like HRC, versus what you need past that threshold in the development space to actually do work that gets to most marginalized folks. Our work in research really fits in a couple of spaces. I mean, there's legal research, so an indexing of laws and policies at the municipal, state, federal, and global level on things from gender recognition laws to adoption to marriage and non-discrimination statutes, and so understanding kind of the legal structure and the policies as they relate to LGBTQ people. We're most well known for our research that is where we look at institutions and we set certain benchmarks on how they perform around inclusion and annually report back on those benchmarks. An example of that is our Corporate Equality Index, where we look at the 1,200 top law firms in the US and what they are doing around their policies as they relate to LGBTQ folks, around discrimination, around public policy advocacy, around employee engagement, around benefits, and making sure that they're inclusive work environments. And so we created this tool to really move the institution of the workplace to be inclusive of LGBT folks, but that model has also been used around hospitals. We have a health equality index. We have a municipal equality index that looks at how do you move municipalities to taking care of their LGBTQ citizens. And so these indexing tools. We also have a series of more one-off reports that happen as funding comes around that actually look at the lived experience of LGBTQ folks. We did have a youth survey that's gone out that was several years ago, that was the largest kind of survey of this experience of LGBTQ youth in the United States. I think that survey is being replicated right now as well, so a new update will be coming soon, but really understand kind of what do those challenges look like. But we've also done that with people's experience in the workplace. It's fascinating for most people to hear that actually millennials are more closeted than the cohort before them at work. We're finding from kind of actual surveys that there's actually a hesitancy to come out in the workplace right now for a variety of reasons that we're still trying to understand. But people may, while institutions are moving, the lived experience of people may not be quite what you expect it to be. And then the other place where we spend a lot of time is really around polling and message testing. We're a political organization at heart. HRC really function in the political space, so we often are trying to understand kind of the mindset of voters and likely voters, especially around LGBTQ issues. And so understanding kind of where people are in specific areas, as well as what messages are effective for talking to them about discrimination and violence of LGBT people. So that's kind of what our work looks like. The US has probably some of the most robust data on LGBTQ people, and there's still very little. We still know very little about kind of the lived experiences of folks. We have reports here and there that give us insights into that, but none of it is as robust and as comprehensive as we like. I think that Sandy will talk a little bit later about the great report and survey that NCTE gets to do. And while it's the most amazing report we have on trans folks in the United States, there's still so much more we need to know, right? So that's kind of a little bit of a start.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then maybe actually turning to you, Sandy. And I should say any of the panelists feel free to jump in as appropriate. And also I should say Sandy needs to leave a little bit early because of a family emergency, so I'll make sure we get to you. But in terms of this study that NCTE recently organized, you were the lead researcher. Could you tell us a little bit about what we do know in terms of the lives of trans people here in the United States? And also maybe if you could say a few words about how you went about collecting that data, because I know you put a lot of thought into data collection in a way that is safe, that doesn't victimize those that you're studying or expose them in ways that they wouldn't want to be exposed, but empowers them instead. And so I think the methodology is really important as well.
Well, thanks first of all for letting me be here, and thanks for the question. There's a few parts to that question. I probably won't get too much into the state of affairs for trans people right now. There are some copies of the executive summary available, and everything's online. Full report's about 300 pages, so there's a few things in there that you can find. But I will start by saying, you know, if you look at even the title of this this event today, it talks about filling the data gap. And one thing that I will state, and we have an issue with, is that in many countries, and particularly the United States, there's a lot of data that is collected by entities such as the federal government. And organizations like mine, like the National Center for Transgender Equality or the Williams Institute or HRC or anybody who's doing a lot of this research to collect data, we're actually trying to fill some of these gaps. If the federal government would, in their American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey or the Decennial Census, ask specifically about LGBTQI folks, then we wouldn't have to fill as much of the gaps, and then resources would become available because we would know about the disparities of these communities. So I think that's one important takeaway from this, that there are actual gaps that could be filled by certain entities. But in the meantime, I think organizations like mine do fill those gaps. So another thing to think about is there are lots of different ways to do research. There's the, you know, the classic academic research model where you write a proposal and you get a grant, hopefully, and then you, quite frankly, descend from on high and then go into communities and try to collect data from people, you know, trans women of color who are living with HIV, something like that. It's just not going to work. You know, usually the sample size, the N, is super low, and it doesn't give us the robust information we really need. And part of that is our mindset. You know, we do it also in the advocacy role when we do this research. Our mindset has to change about how we are collecting data. We're not researching people because we just want to collect the data about them. We want to know about these experiences and collect it in a genuine way so that we can, in turn, have this information in some way benefit the communities. I see head nods, so I think you're with me on this. There has been a problem overall in research in the way we go about collecting data from communities, and we need it to be much more community-centered, community-focused. That means that you've actually got to create some genuine connections, establishing genuine connections with folks before just running in there and saying I've got a grant and I've got to buy 19 trans women of color, right? So one of the ways in which we did it, and I am not in any way going to say that we were perfect about it. There are lots of gaps in our data collection too. One of the ways we went about it was we actually got community involved in it. So we used it at networks of I think over 400 organizations we were connected with who were connected with trans people. There's no way that I could just go out and say, hey, trans people, take my survey. And even with NCTE, you're just not going to be able to do it. You're going to miss certain people who are often underrepresented, right? So people of color are often underrepresented, older folks are often represented, people in rural communities. And so you've got to do some extra legwork to try to be able to reach these people. So we used a model in which we could really connect with just these different points of connection that people in the community might have, and went out and we had all kinds of campaigns. There's a really great methodology chapter that you should absolutely read. It's a page turner. About 15 pages or so. Read through it, but we did go into all of the ways in which we tried to establish different connections and let people know, no, this is about us. This is for us. We need to use this data. It's not just so that NCTE can say, I've got a report. It's not just so that we can go in and do our advocacy, because it is incredibly important to be able to say to a member of Congress, no, you've got people in your constituency who are trans. You've got to listen to us. But also, it becomes a resource by which people can get grants for their own grassroots advocacy organizations, all sorts of things. So, if there's any takeaway from this, is that I think we really have got to get away from the idea that the way to do research is to come up with a plan and then go find people. It's actually to sit down with folks while you're developing your questionnaire. So we brought people in to look over our questionnaire so they could be part of it, so they could be invested in it. So then they would say, this is a genuine product. Let's all take it together. There's so many things I can say about this, and I'm very passionate about this. As I said, we have gaps in the way we collected data, but it was a start. And we need to get into community-centered research, particularly when you go into communities around the world where it is much harder for people to come out and take something like this. Are we providing safe places for people to take a survey? Often we're not thinking about that sort of thing. So I'll leave it there because I could go on for probably days. So
we'll follow up, and after a few questions, we'll open this up to the audience for your questions. But Phil, maybe you can then help take us from kind of the U.S. domestic side to the international, where there's even less data. In some of your work at the World Bank, I know you've been thinking about how to collect data in developing economies where it's often much more difficult to get any data and difficult to reach LGBT populations, particularly in the nearly 80 countries that criminalize consensual relationships. So you're essentially asking people to identify as a criminal for a survey purpose, right? Which is a challenging quest. So maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I mean, so as you say, this is a lot of research that I did at the World Bank, so I kind of dived into those experiences, and then I turned to what we plan to do at the National Gay Muslim Chamber of Commerce with upcoming research. So I pull from both of those experiences. I think what you're asking is the safety risks. And to be clear, there are many safety risks, but fortunately, there's many ways to mitigate those safety risks and to promote participant safety and ethical concerns. And I think in my upcoming answer, I put these recommendations into like 3 buckets. And the first bucket is to really dig into those ethical concerns and those ethical guidelines that have already been established, often by the ICRW. And the biggest one there is to submit your research to an institutional review board. I think it's just like one of the best practice ways to do no harm, right? Also, while doing no harm, I think researchers need to respect the wishes, rights, dignity of communities, ensure confidentiality, safety, security, and to provide informed consent, and also just train your researchers in best practices, but also specific vulnerabilities of LGBTI people. Again, this is the first bucket of do no harm. It's a baseline I see. The second one is, doing good, is maximizing good. And in this, I see it as kind of going to what you were saying, which is community-centered and focused research. And for me, that comes to listening and consulting to LGBTI groups. And in doing so, we need to have good consultations and not just, invite the most visible of the LGBTI community, but also look for the most marginalized in these conversations. If possible, use their spaces. It's just a best practice to promote their safety. Another one is to work with local researchers, because in so many countries there are academics or research institutions that are just ready to work with us on these issues. In doing all of this, first do your homework and undertake a really thorough literature review. In every country I've looked at, which has been about 30 to 40 at this point, there's always good stories and qualitative data to draw from, much like Ty was talking about. And we really need to understand the context in which we are doing this research. I think in having a community-centered and focused research, as you were saying, it comes to seeing LGBTI communities as part and parcel of this research and getting their input on research questions, as well as participant-driven categories, and seeing how and having this question in the back of your mind, how the final data and analysis might be interpreted in negative ways. I think it's not just about the data collection itself, but it's also about the end result. So having these questions in mind is what I see as the doing good bucket. And then finally, the third one, which is just doing really good, right? Is doing really good research. And I think we can turn to ICRW as being one of the examples, and also Sandy's organization as well, for doing some really cutting edge research. And I think the most important thing here is, insofar as possible, try to capture intersectionality. I think the qualitative components of any mixed method research can really capture that quite well, and we need to do that. Disaggregate data. I think this one's, we just need to do that to really fill in these gaps of the LGBTI acronym. I think most of the data is skewed towards the G, the gay men in that acronym, and we really need to disaggregate so as to understand more of the LGBTI in that acronym. Again, provide spaces for alternative experiences and identities. And for me, this last one in terms of doing cutting edge research is really try to create partnerships with many parts of society, like organizations, governmental champions, parts of the private sector, so that our findings actually turn into data-driven policies, right? It's not just enough that we do great research so that it can sit on a shelf. It needs to be utilized by different policymakers or organizations in countries. This gets into another point that I'll come up to later, which is, I think for me, the paradigm shift that we need to see, that we need to push for LGBTI data is going from this piecemeal approach to seeing how we can create an LGBTI research infrastructure, where we bring together diverse actors to analyze, to collect, analyze data, and turn that into progressive policies. For me, that research infrastructure is something that I'm always trying to talk about. It sounds a little bit lofty, but they exist in every part of our lives, from the social to the environmental to the medical sciences and almost everywhere else. So for me, my challenge to us in these spaces is how do we create that research infrastructure.
So maybe building on that, just a question on disaggregated data, right? And maybe Sandy, first to you, but I'd be interested in any of the views of any of the panelists on this. Obviously, the NCTE study was a deep dive in an attempt to disaggregate the LGBT community and really look at trans community. How unusual is that sort of disaggregated focus? And then I guess the other part of that, the other side to that question is, how common is it to have aggregated data? And where do we have the aggregated data, and what do we use that aggregated data for? And where, I'm just trying to tease out when we disaggregate, when we aggregate, and when it's a bad idea to mix the two up.
Well, so in terms of how common it is, I think it is what most researchers who are doing some kind of pure research where they're asking a question of a group of people, they know often that question is not really something that can be generalized to other groups of people, if that makes sense to you. So Phil mentioned that a lot of the research has been focused on the G and the acronym for so long, it was incredibly important for us to collect information about trans people at my organization, because usually what will happen in spaces, although we have years and years and years of really important anecdotal evidence, right? People's stories are so important. Often, you know, policymakers, they just don't want to hear it until you quantify it, until you can say, you know, well, how many trans people does that even impact? How many trans people do we even have? Like, I don't have. There are no trans people in Iowa. Of course there are. So it's really, you know, I know there's at least one or two. But it's incredibly important to collect this data. And I think most researchers know that this is something that you have to do, because, you know, there's no way we can do justice, I think, to asking about the experiences of intersex people in a study that is about just, you know, that's focused on lesbian and gay folks and the issues that are impacting them. Because you're not getting into some of the medical issues, you're not getting into some of the disability rights argument issues and all of these self-care advocacy issues. There's no way you can do it with one sweeping study. Otherwise, it will be about 1,000 questions long, and nobody wants to take that. So it's incredibly important to be able to disaggregate, and I think most researchers understand that. But often, I think this really comes down to resources, because often for research, there are grants that have incredibly narrow requirements around it, right? So you have to only study MSM population. And well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, why are trans women included with MSM? That's wrong. So can we expand this to trans women, or is it just, you know, until we have funding streams and funding models that allow for people to research and collect the data we actually need about communities, instead of dictating some very narrow ideals around what research should look like, I think there will be a problem in continuing to do this disaggregated research. But in terms of whether or not it's common, it's not common enough. We don't do it enough. We're not collecting enough of the data, but I think most researchers understand that that is what we have to do. It's incredibly difficult to put it all together.
Well, and Kai, maybe to you, right? Since HRC, you know, represents the different subgroups within the broader LGBTQI community, you know, how do you folks think about that?
Well, the thing that just popped into chatting is I looked back at some public opinion polling in the U.S. last week, and the question about, do you know a lesbian or gay person? A question we presented to likely voters in the U.S. There's data on this back, I think even pre-80s, like late 70s. And we've seen a shift kind of from, I think it was around 1978, from 25% saying, yes, I know someone who is lesbian or gay, to today, and we're at 75%. And we've also seen progress as that number has grown, and we know that kind of as people know us, people support us and take action and vote on our behalf and talk about us and kind of make inclusive workplaces and things like that. That question has not had, there's not data as far as, do you know a trans person that goes anywhere near that far back? And I think that kind of the most recent numbers, I think from last year, was around 30%, which is a huge increase because only a few years before it was almost half of that. So there's been a massive tipping point hit on kind of familiarity with people, with trans colleagues, family members, folks around them in their communities. But if we had asked that question altogether, do you know an LGBT person? We wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't, what we're seeing from that data would not have the same impact on all of this about what we need to be doing. What needs to be done to kind of provide more visibility and more public education, more access to trans communities and trans folks to kind of move the messaging or move public opinion forward. And so just knowing kind of like if we had asked that question as a question that didn't differentiate between populations, the answer would give us such a different take on what we should be doing.
That's helpful. And Phil, maybe in terms of both the research you've seen coming out of the World Bank and some of the research you're looking at now with the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, I mean, how much of that has been disaggregated sort of for the economic empowerment argument I mean, is there a difference between sort of the public health research that you've seen coming through those institutions versus the sort of economic style analysis?
Sure. So if I understand correctly, like there is this realm of health-related, often HIV-related data on communities, and how is that different from the economic development data that we gathered?
Right, and how is that different? And is one of them doing a better job? Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, most of the economic data I've seen seems to aggregate, right? I haven't seen a lot of, maybe I'm wrong, but in kind of the macroeconomic data on LGBT people and education, employment, seems to kind of aggregate. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there have been more attempts.
Right. So I mean, in a few examples, at
least at the global level. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can only speak to the research that I did, which was, I mean, a lot of data collection in India, Thailand, Western Balkans, even Georgia, the South Caucasus, and we did really try to disaggregate there. We really tried to get a survey instrument that allowed for a diversity of identities and experiences, and that was extremely important, and that kind of gets us past the health-related MSM, HIV paradigm that was going on. But yeah, in Thailand, for example, I mean, just to go into participant-driven categories, we worked with communities so that they developed their own categories, and then we use those categories to capture experiences later on, which is extremely important because the LGBTQI acronym doesn't really map onto the diversity of experiences and identities in Thailand. So having these third gender categories, having these other categories that kind of blend the LGBTI sexual orientation alongside the gender identity categories was extremely important for us. That came to really rich analysis at the end, which was really very helpful when we were working with the government to say that for your more feminine gay man, here is the experiences that they face, and here's might be a policy that can specifically target them. I think that was extremely important for us, and I do see it as being much better than the health-related data that has been gathered historically.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, as we think about disaggregating, right, we have to be careful not to disaggregate in a way that presupposes categories on communities that don't want to be characterized that way, which in the global context is often a challenge, even though we need to get at that more specific information. Well, I have a few more questions, and I do have a couple wrap-up questions for these folks, but I'd love to open it up now, because I know all of you have great questions and have been thinking about this. Please.
Jill Gay, What Works Association. Question for you, Phil. What, sorry, I had to look at the, what has been, have you done the research through the World Bank? And if so, what have been the topics that are not health related that you feel have been not done harm, done good?
Okay, so the first one is trying to capture potential socioeconomic impact of violence as well as discrimination. Because when I was at the World Bank, I just kept coming across this stereotype that all LGBT people are rich, right? Like there are some rich LGBT people, but there's also some poor people. The question is, right? That was some years ago because there was no data to draw from. I think, personally, without that data that allows stereotypes to become empowered and to grow. So we really wanted to try to ask the question, is there a socioeconomic impact by virtue of discrimination as well as violence? And we found that there was this cycle of poverty that emerged for LGBT, not intersex, LGBT people in India, particularly the L and the T in that. And what we found was fascinating because, even though there might be more money in their pockets, this is looking at trans people in particular, even though they might have had more money in their pockets due to sex work, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're more socioeconomically empowered because they had to face so much discrimination in accessing financial services that they had to use the cash in their pockets to mitigate that discrimination, like landlords, for instance. So that's why we have these, these different ways of looking at socioeconomic status of poverty, which is through either the cash in your pocket or the ability to consume goods and access financial services. So there we did find this clear cycle of poverty that emerged, and I think that is a doing research,
Absolutely. Did it have any impact on the way that the bank did anything? Sorry, I've done some consulting for the bank, so I have my prejudices.
In India, no, because I think the World Bank Country Office is just won't act on these data, right? It's and I say this because I don't work there anymore. I can. But in terms of generating data and contributing to a much larger conversation on cycles of poverty, the socioeconomic impacts of discrimination and violence, I think it added. I think so that's one example in India. Another example is making the macroeconomic argument. So what is the aggregate cost of when you exclude LGBT people from employment, healthcare, schools, etc., which is another way of getting governments to move is when we make this GDP argument. And then there was just finally the work that I led on violence, and looking at violence not as just a quick snapshot, but looking at the impact across the lifetime of violence, which has been done in the gender equality world, and I think it's something that we can really run in the LGBTQI space.
Hi, I'm Noor from Change. Thank you all for being here. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I'm glad to be here. I don't know who to pose my question to, so I guess you all can answer it. So with data collection and data analysis, I was wondering if you could speak to two things that are very important to me, which is one, advocacy and preservation of dignity, and then also like the role that it plays in, I guess, securing justice for these individuals, and if the data that you collect and that you work with supports that, and how is it integrated into data collection?
I'll take a crack at that. I think one of the most important starting points, and Sandy already mentioned, actually all of panelists mentioned it, is that you start with the research subject. It's their data. So the very first and very final way of thinking about this is the data belongs to them. It's about their lives. It's about how they prioritize what is most important in their lives. These are populations that experience extremes of exclusion. They can be very articulate, and they always are, about what they need to see change and how they prioritize it. And it might be very different from country to country. You can't generalize this easily, and that's just the way it is. It's inconvenient for us who like to do lovely comparative comparisons across all the countries. We can't do that very well in this case. I think when you put the research subjects at the center of any attempt to collect data, you are acknowledging their dignity. You are basically saying, this is about you. Help us to be a facilitator, a way to help empower you to better understand in ways that can change policy, that can change development benefits, etc. We can help that and facilitate that, but this is about you. And this is for you to control, this is for you to steer. And then when we leave, this is for you to keep. This is data that is not just going to go into a hard drive someplace, which is always scary anyway. But it's for them to use, to work with their own organizations around how to build better strategies to move their own particular priorities ahead, how to carry on updating of that data safely, how to make sure that that data does not fall in the wrong hands. This is about their agency. And there's no better tribute to their dignity than putting them at the center of this and making this all about them. So we're not there to take data. We're there to facilitate that articulation of the realities that they are living in ways that can reach other people. It's expanding their voices, empowering their voices. And that might lead, at some point, to justice. But we've got so many steps to go through before people even understand the notion of justice for people who are excluded at this level of exclusion and dehumanization.
Can I add just something to that? And unfortunately, I have to run off. But that was so beautifully said, and and I alluded to it earlier, but if when you're going about your project, you haven't actually started by consulting someone first who actually knows and lives that experience, then I feel like you've already lost. Like it's too late to bring someone in to do your pilot testing on to see if the question is okay. You've got to have those folks involved in the very inception of the project. And to speak to the data analysis portion of it, again, we are often beholden to funders, and we have to write a report that speaks to this or this or this. But if we can find a way to also make sure that we are analyzing data, producing products that folks can use themselves, yeah, I will crank out the report that my funder needs to keep them happy, but I also want to make sure the data is available to people who need it in different ways, which means that I might have to aggregate data in a way that is not necessarily that important to my organization or to the grant funder itself, but I have resources perhaps, whether it's some stats person who can do all of this, that can make that accessible to someone so that they need something broken down by region or city, and we can get them that data. Making that data accessible, because it's often not accessible. The statistical software is ridiculous. It's expensive. You need so much education to even figure that stuff out. It's just not accessible. And also these surveys, I can't tell you how many people have asked me, oh, did you just do that on SurveyMonkey? No. No. Heavily programmed. And you can't access that sort of thing without having someone who knows how to program surveys. So beyond having people involved in the very inception of the project, I think you've got to make sure that they still have access all along the way. They might not be able to process the data themselves, so providing some kind of way for them to actually be able to get a product that they need for their grant writing or for whatever they need at the end, that's incredibly important. So I think making that accessible to the end is really good. I'm so sorry, I've got to
Thank you.
I really like the justice element of this question, and I think one way to look at that is how data are so crucial for the criminal justice system, and how in so many countries police don't collect data on hate crimes because either there's no law on hate crimes, there's no law on hate crimes that include sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status, or they just commit violence against LGBTQI people. So this is a really good question in terms of how police need to collect those data on hate crimes and how that goes into the criminal justice system from the police to the courts.
Hi guys. I have a question for both Chloe and Phil around the future of research, because what I understand through the ideas of complexity sciences that we recently saw most effectively used in the Oxford Analytica work done by the Trump campaign to really literally understand almost everyone down to like 1,000, maybe 5,000 pinpoints of who they were and who they were going to vote for and why. I think this is the future, not necessarily just a one-off event that's going to really transform the whole way that research is done. I also feel that within our shared spaces, particularly as we look globally, that as we look here at the title, sexual and gender minorities, that the ideas and identities around these issues are going to become much more blurred. And I think it's so critical that we have this specific disaggregated data that gets down right to the point to understand the complexities in each space, but I also see where these issues are aligned here at ICRW, where are we just talking about women? What kind of women? Which are there gendered expression? What is gender in your space, Phil? Businesses, private sector. How are all these people coming together to understand these issues? And particularly as we think about the ways in which things get funded, it usually comes from you have to ask that first question in the first place, and if that question from the private sector or even in the development community is still framed in a manner that suggests economics is the where it's at, or it's HIV and public health, that's where it's at, and the questions and the outcomes become based on those. So as we blur, where do you see this work going, and how do we make sure that we're a part of it? and that we understand it in those complex ways that it exists. I hope that's clear.
I think we start by not blurring. I mean,
Okay.
very, very intentional about trying to get precision and not only the data we get, but the questions we ask, to be really clear about what is our purpose for getting this information, what needs to change. And for all researchers, the most important question is, so what? You know, anytime we think about a question, that's the, you know, a survey question, that's what we have to pose to ourselves, so what? What would change if we happen to know this information? There's a certain tolerance that people have for answering questions, and that's limited. So that's important. You made a really good observation about we are in the International Center for Research on Women. We've been doing this for 40 years. There's no more populous, marginalized group than women. So we have been developing methodologies and applications to understand the marginalization of women and girls for 40 years. So we're sitting on an enormous experience base of how to get that information in ways that can change policy, that can drive evidence-led advocacy, that can influence intersectional understandings. We simply need to expand that to embrace excluded people more generally. It's not quite as simple as that sounds, but I mean, I'm saying that in the sense that we're coming to this with a lot of momentum and a lot of understanding about how to do complicated research well and how to deal with exclusion and inclusion in a sensitive and important, you know, focused way. That's what we're moving in this, is to try to harness those energies, those experiences, those competencies within the people that work here and in our office overseas, to use that experience in ways that haven't been used before. And I'm saying that quite categorically. The kinds of work that we're trying to do on inclusion has just never been done. And certainly at this level of sophistication. So to try to get that data on stream, we have a lot of work ahead of us. So the future is a long way ahead to actually get the kinds of results that will make the changes that are way overdue. And that's the tragic part of this, is people are suffering, people are struggling, people are living these very fraught lives of exclusion, and worse, the violence is extraordinary. And we feel that pressure. We are a very passionate bunch here, and we feel that pressure, and it's frustrating for us that we can't move this research agenda ahead much faster.
And my answer of where this is going is always biased by where I want it to be going.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll put the optimistic spin on this, which is that I do see conversations like these data-driven conversations, how to do more research, how to fill these data gaps, happening more in parts of the world, and these spaces are great. And what we really need to do is just get serious on the funding.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so minuscule, it's so tiny. It's just like, this is 2017, and as a community, we deserve more funding to go to these very serious issues. And the global point of the project made these estimates in terms of, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago, in terms of how much funding internationally is going toward LGBTQI issues. They found a very tiny amount. And of that tiny amount, 5% of that went to research. Wow. These are just estimates, but I think it does kind of validate what we feel as researchers in the space, which is just there's no funding toward it. And I think to get there, I mean, part of what we're doing with the National Game Resident Chamber of Commerce is working with the private sector, who is willing to invest more in the analytical knowledge side of this. As Chloe said, this is the International Center for Research on Women, and there's such an awesome body of evidence and methodologies and data when it comes to women, right? And I think for me, learning from the gender equality advocates, as well as HIV key population advocates, to do what they did, but quicker is where we can be going, right? Like, I mean, gender, like one example, the DHS, which is USAID sponsored, is amazing, and it's disseminated in dozens of countries, and they added this gender-based violence module on it, which now gives us like the largest data set of women experienced GBV. That's an incredible thing to learn from, and it's something that we can apply to in the LGBTI space. And I think the last thing for this comment is just to, for me, again, how do we have this larger conversation of a more robust long-term research infrastructure where we come together, convene, agree upon the indicators, where we come together, convene, learn from each other, leverage resources and networks, and then go from there.
How do you, how have you targeted hard-to-reach communities, marginalised groups? So say some people from the BME community may not want to come out and talk about their sexuality because of the cultural impact on them and the consequences of actually coming out. So in Britain, there are a lot of good movements out there, but actually when I meet young people who want to come out and they've kind of got a very secret life, so they kind of have this life at home. So being in India, I know that there are groups where people come out, but they are kind of really marginalised out of society. But I just wanted to see your thoughts about it. Because actually it's only good as the information, isn't it, the research? So we don't have all the delegates to be involved in it, so yeah, just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. When stigma is too high that people don't want to self-identify as LGBTI. Yeah, I mean, there's different methodologies you can use. I think, in person versus online. Online provides that anonymity where you can maybe identify as an LGBTI person. I think that's one way. There are different methodologies. But then I think in doing like gold standard research in the LGBTI space, if we were to look at like the G and the B, those with same-sex attractions, like there's 3 tiers by which you can even ask them.
Yeah.
First is, do you identify as LGBT? The second is, do you have same-sex attractions? And then the third is, have you been with a partner of the same sex for the past number of years? So there's many ways to get at this question, which can kind of get around that unwillingness to identify as LGBTQI by looking at your actions or your attractions. But then I think the best is just to really establish a trust between researcher and the communities that they're working with, so that you can kind of push past that.
So this is also a question for all 3 panelists now. But so in terms of once data is collected and we're working towards policy, how do we account for the inside and outside lives of policy decisions that do target these groups? Because even though if we get the data, if we get the policies, then we have to wait for the policymakers to actually push forth that policy, and then we have to wait for society to react to those policies and for real change to occur. So how do we, I don't know if the question is how do we speed it up, or how do we account for that lost time in terms of pushing forth real change from gathering data?
Well, there's 2 ways I would put forward, one of which is we don't do that, they do. I mean, this is about empowering people to tell their own stories in ways that are different than they have before, that can reach decision makers in ways that they can more easily act to achieve change, especially when they are speaking very loudly and persistently, and they feel empowered to do that because they've got the data to show that. But there's no getting around the fact that we have attitudes that need to be changed, and those behaviors come from those changes of attitudes, and that's a long process. And even changing attitudes is not enough. We have to get underneath where the attitudes come from, the social norms. And that's possible to do. There's excellent research that's being done right now on understanding and making explicit what those norms are, working with communities. We've seen this with female genital mutilation, cutting, getting people that have these entrenched cultural traditions to say, wait a minute, that's not us anymore. That's not who we are. But that's a process, and it's a process that takes time. That's the only way to sustain it over a long time, is to get right down to the foundational level of where is this coming from. It's the same as gender-based violence. Where is this coming from? That's the only way we're ever going to stop it, to understand that. So, more research money, please. And more.
Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, HRC is good at taking data and turning it into messages on a 2-year political cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I kind of initially comes to mind is just it undermines the need for data to get data to do advocacy. By all means, kind of like any advocacy we do, if you're looking, we're talking US focused, like you have a fact sheet on like what is the actual situation, what is the problem, how do we describe it, and research informs how we write about that. Sometimes in the US we still don't have data, so it's anecdotal. So we'll tell 3 stories, and if we can pull a stat from somewhere, great. But it's tough. I mean, one of the things that folks may not recognize is the first real LGBT protection that was passed into law by our federal government was 2009. And that was our hate crimes law that protected people by for crimes against them based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And really, a lot of the backbone in being able to move that both had to do with the politics in 2009, but also the fact that in the 90s, the Justice Department started collecting statistics on hate crimes against people based on sexual orientation. And so, I mean, that was over a decade worth of collecting those data points, and those data points are incredibly inaccurate in the sense that municipalities self-report and police officials self-report about what's done, what happens in their jurisdiction. But it gives you like a tip of the iceberg that the problem is significant enough that we need to recognize this as a specific type of crime. And so, yes, it takes a while from data to turn to policy and as well as affect public opinion and change public opinion and affect cultural norms. But just, you have to start collecting the data.
Yeah.
Like, we've got to get out there and start collecting it to get to those places, because without anything, we have a really, we don't have those stories and that data to actually support our advocacy efforts.
Sure. To anyone, actually, is there a space to go away from big organizations coming into smaller countries and collecting data, and instead capacity development of local grassroots organization to understand how to collect good quality, actionable data? And how do you change that? How do you change this conversation?
There's no other way. I mean, that's all we do that all the time. We always work with local organizations. We help them to develop their capacity. They have the best ability to communicate locally within cultural, parameters. We could never come in and just do it ourselves. So that makes no sense at all. Both for the doing research well, but also because it is their data. This is for them to do. We're simply facilitating. It's not as simple as it sounds, because there's a lot that has to be taught and capacity that has to be developed. But absolutely, this is work that they get the capacity to do. We help them to do that. They carry on with it, and our job is done. They can leave a country and know that we've worked with 2 or 3 NGOs and helped them to develop really robust capacity to collect data and store data, keep it safe, keep it ethical, and then use it well. Wow, that's good work.
Absolutely. So Lee Badgett and I write in Investigating Research Revolution for LGBTQI inclusion, which is like the need to really invest in universities and LGBTQI organizations in a number of countries so that they can expand their capacity to undertake research. And again, that's partly what we did in the HIV epidemic in the United States, training folks, universities, members of the community to research what was not understood to be HIV, but then was understood to be HIV, to understand that, research that on their own terms. And I think it's absolutely part and parcel of doing this on the long term.
Good afternoon, Robin McCutcheon, Foreign Service Officer and General Troublemaker at the Department of State. Just back from 3 years in Central Asia.
Wow.
And covering all 5 countries of Central Asia in a regional position. On the subject of what we're talking about today, though, on data collection, one thing I'm very happy about is we were 3 for 3 in my 3 years out there, winning small grants from the Office of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at state for LGBT issues. And 2 of those were used. One was for Feminita, which was doing a study on position of women and lesbian women in Kazakhstan, both conditions and needs assessment. Also, Alma TQ, which is covering the needs of, of the trans community. Now, both groups have developed, I don't know anything about data collection. I'm a Foreign Service Officer, kilometer wide, millimeter deep. So we give the money, they do their studies, I read the reports, I'm fascinated. If I do my job, I write it up in a State Department cable, goes back to Washington. They will write up a final report, tie up the grant. And in fact, as Chloe says, I know that Alma TQ, we gave them a follow-on grant. They are trying to influence the legal procedures.
Oh, wow.
And actually do have an insider in the Ministry of Health who might be on their side. But in terms of funneling any of this information up, do you know anything, HRC, ICWC, World Bank, about when we do these small grants and collect this data? Or do we have to wait for the next WikiLeaks to leak State Department cables?
No, I mean, I think that the thing you bring up is one that's kind of important too, is that there's not a great clearinghouse that kind of holds kind of all this information where we see what's going on, what the various research projects look like, what data has been collected. And I think a lot of it gets missed probably if we're not happen to be on the right email listservs. And I mean, the world is small in this space to some extent, so a lot we do get in some ways. There's a lot I'm sure we miss because there's not kind of a clear way to get all the various research projects that are going on around the globe that deal with LGBTQ minorities. No, and so I mean, it's actually one of the challenges out there is actually knowing the full survey of what's being done. Yeah.
And Robin, I know you know this well, but if the groups could report that data back into the embassy for the annual human rights report, that would be great.
Oh, they do, but you know, our annual human rights report, they'll get one small section on LGBTI conditions, and it's usually staffed by an entry-level first tour officer who's in a rush.
But they generally love data. Get them data, because then they actually have like numbers to report on, which seems to excite them. So.
Congratulations on that, Mark, and for being that troublemaker. I think as a non-state person, I'm great.
The benefits of almost being at age out age.
I'm Joe Schaffner, I'm Senior Communications Specialist here with ICRW. Mine is actually not my own question. I wanted to recognize that we have an online audience today, so I wanted to at least bring Anthony Cotton's question in. Do you share any opportunities or challenges, i.e. data quality, persuasiveness of the data, of performing targeted research on the lived realities, development outcomes of a specific population, i.e. LGBTI, with the intention of comparing those results to data that is already available for the broader population? That's a little bit more in there. Very simplistic question. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I mean,
It's very
this is what it's all about at the end of the day. The data's not going to do anything, it just sits there. It doesn't persuade people to change the way they think and allocate. That's really important. I keep going back to what Phil's been saying about infrastructure, about creating a way that this messaging can be brought together and comparisons built on that so that there's a body, there's a literature, which we have very strongly in the HIV space. That's very persuasive. That's coming from really top-flight researchers from around the world. If we can do that in our space across the full range of lived experiences of LGBTQI people, we begin to create a platform for change. But the persuasiveness depends on it not being riddled with gaps. And that's where we're at right now. We can come out with really interesting studies and they'll tell you something about someone or a small group in one or two contexts. And I'm back to that so what question. We can't answer that so what question until we have a comprehensive picture of the lived realities of these excluded populations. And the anecdotal evidence says it's pretty grim. And it's way past due that we start filling in those spaces so we can be persuasive. We can actually bring this information forward in ways that it's almost embarrass people to attend to this. This is just not okay to let this go on and on and on and simply not take even the first step in funding the kind of research that we need to create that persuasive platform. And that's where we're at right now. And it's frustrating.
Why don't we take two questions here and then we'll have some wrap-up comments.
So something that I think about a lot is the term transgender is used really in an international and a national concept, and I think something that I'm researching now is on heteros, and a lot of heteros don't identify as transgender. So when researching gender variant groups, how do you mitigate that complication in trying to translate that information to the West so we can interpret it and see what's going on internationally?
Well, I was doing that in Sunrise in India, working in that context, to some extent, meeting with both hetero and transgender people, and they do identify differently. Although they often accept overlap. More hetero will say, well, I'm also transgender. You won't get many transgender identified that say they're hetero. So that's a really specific cultural identity. It's really hard, but it's evolving, and it's a space that we really need to let them articulate how they want to be identified in a way that's effective. And we can tell them what the constraints are in terms of, we don't understand. I mean, one of the best things I can do is just keep going. So I'm coming from America, tell me what this means. Because I don't really get it, even though I've studied it a lot. It's much better to begin like you don't know anything. And let them unfold the story. Let them sort of make the distinctions in their own language, their own way, and build that up so that we do begin to get a base of understanding. I don't think it's it's been raised a lot by different people as a huge problem. I don't actually see it as a huge problem. I think the commonalities so far outweigh the differences. And the experiences of exclusion are so similar across these different shades of determination and identity that we kind of miss the bus if we were looking just at the differences all the time. There's so much work to be done in attending to the exclusions right now.
And that it's even more complicated in the intersex context, right? If we're really talking about intersex, most intersex people, well, a significant number, probably a majority, don't actually identify as a community. They identify with a particular medical issue, right? And a vast array of different medical issues, right? So, the idea of coming up with the lived reality of intersex people in any country is in itself incredibly complicated.
And that's what we came across in research in Thailand, India, same thing. I mean, not forcing a T for transgender anyone to them, but having them come up with categories. And in India, for example, we also come across many self-identifying transgender people as well as their gender neutral, airlines, etc. Even in Latin America, I noticed that there's 3 Ts, and it's not just transgender, and it's categories that come from them, and it's really important to respect that in the survey as well.
One more question.
I do. So this kind of data that we're talking about, non-anecdotal data, can be used to bolster different kinds of advocacy arguments. Like you talked about the hit to countries' GDP because of discrimination, or you could talk about human rights abuses and dignity, or you could frame it as a public health problem. Which of those strategies, what's the balance between those 3 that you think would be most useful in this political climate, and what would you like to see in the future?
How much money do you have?
I think this is probably even part of the wrap up. And I'm going to jump ahead of you guys to try to take away the one thing I'd say is that the real obstacle here, I mean, it's pretty apparent, is it's just that there's been such a low level of funding for this type of research. We're happy for anything. Like, we don't get to set the strategy. I mean, we aren't getting to kind of pick and choose what we get to do. There's so little data that we're excited when we have any funder that will step up to the plate to provide funding to allow research that can then inform both advocacy work but also development work, and kind of making sure our communities are not marginalized and left out of the great streams of funding that's coming from so many governments and other places to support development work. And so it would be great if we could be much more thoughtful and set out a strategy that really prioritizes stuff more than it is right now, but there's just not even funding going into this space. I mean, we're at the real beginning where we're just trying to find folks to step up to the plate and put money in the coffers to support research, and recognizing the impact that research can have on the bigger picture of how LGBTQ minorities are really marginalized in a lot of places and excluded from economies and other parts of life. And so I would love to jump to it, but it's also just looking at where we sit right now. We're just trying to find folks to think that it's a valuable thing to do to invest in this type of research.
And I just think, methodologically, the challenge, of course, is to work through the complexity, to understand the intersectionality, to grasp it in all of its complexity. And that is serious research. That's creating indexes. That's really trying to get to articulate those relationships and the interactions that come from those relationships, and then from that to generate the kinds of indicators that we need to cover all that diversity. And it has been done. It's been done in other fields, in poverty measurements, etc. Very sophisticated indexes and tools that are done in that space. They cost money. And even getting a sort of basic index, we're not there yet. And it shouldn't be this hard. You know, the fact that we can't even attract basic money to do even a rudimentary index is a real.
Could you just say a word, or Phil as well, about the UNDP World Bank effort to create a human development index that would actually be a comprehensive look at LGBT, I don't think you're doing I, experiences?
I'll start with that because that's where we both work together at the bank. And there's lots of different ways of approaching an index. An index is just a coordinating way of thinking methodologically about research, and from that, the relationships are established. But even there, an index points at something. There are premises that are underpinning that index. So, you know, the index that we're working on here at ICRW is looking at the lived realities of LGBTQI people in their own terms. This is really the capability approach, Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, David Crocker, people like that, who work with communities to let them articulate what their priorities are of a truly human life, what does dignity mean to you. And this is trying to capture their experience of exclusion and what they would like in terms of prioritizing parameters of inclusion. That's complicated, but it's a particular focus that we're trying to get to because to us it's fundamental to the starting point for all this work, which is human dignity itself. The bank work that Phil and I were working on is coming at it from a different direction. I'm absolutely convinced that, and I'll let you should say something about the bank, but I think there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of complementarity that needs to be happening with these different exercises in creating these indexes. It's not yet there right now. It's back to the infrastructure problem. You want to say something about the banks and what UNDP?
Yeah, so UNDP started and then the World Bank came in. How about it was trying to come up with more similar indicators that can be applied globally when people feel that, you know, collect data from now on. They first brought together civil society from everywhere to come up with the themes in which that are most important to LGBTI organizations and people. And that was, you know, citizen security, violence, health, education, employment, financial well-being, and there's one more, political participation. That's right. So it's those five, and I can only remember 4. So they're going to this period of working with civil society again to fully tease out the specific indicators that fall within those priority themes, right? And then eventually, I think they're going to try to turn that into an index, but I'm not quite sure because I stepped away from that work. But I like that because it's trying to come up with indicators that, you know, we can agree upon, that we can start to make a little bit more cohesive or like comparable in the long term, right? Because that's what we're lacking right now, is ways to really compare this across countries and also over time within a country. So I think that's doing it. But to get back to your question, I really like it because I don't see like inherent differences between these ways of using data to inform action, right? There's the health-based approach, there's the economic GDP, there's the human rights-based approach. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. And for example, in the work of the bank, like often the macroeconomic modeling was informed by human rights-based indicators. So for me, and as Chloe was just saying, there's a lot of overlap, and that's great. But as an activist, like, I wouldn't say which one is needed more in the long term. I just like that there's fully teased out empirical arguments to take so that when we engage a policymaker, when we engage someone in the private sector, we can have A through Z arguments to take. And I think that's really powerful.
Great. Well, my last question is going to be, how do we go from here and move this into action? So any final thoughts you have, and then let's end a few minutes early so people stay. So what should we all be doing when we walk out of here?
Well, I mean, I hope folks walk away recognizing we have a tremendous way to go around getting real global data, and that kind of knowing that there is a lot of opportunity for folks to help fill that gap if they have resources to be able to do so. But there's massive gaps, and because of the gaps, I think that the work that's done that affects other communities often might miss people from the LGBTQ community because there's not that specific data pointing to their experience and the experience they have in their communities.
I guess for me, anybody involved in development, particularly that community, I would love for you to walk away with one word in your mind. This is a real nerdy thing to say. Baseline. I mean, if we can really focus on having, getting to the place where there are real baselines for development for LGBTQI people, so much is possible when we can start saying, here's the starting point, look at the results we've achieved. Without those baselines, we're stalled. And that's tragic in terms of the development benefits and right now not flowing to these excluded populations. And it's inexcusable. From a moral perspective, it's absolutely inexcusable. We can't simply just throw up our hands and say we don't have a baseline. Get the damn baseline.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just to really learn from other social movements out there and how they use data in the long term, and to really get, for me, getting serious about creating an LGBTI research infrastructure. And in this, it's about the long term and convening and working together a little bit more than researchers in the LGBTI space have been doing thus far. And so doing, funding is a huge concern, and there we need to target the private sector a lot more than we have been. And that's what I'm doing with the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And I'm excited that there is this interest and they can contribute more resources. This is also something that we're trying to do with the Organization for American States, and specifically the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, LGBTI Rapporteurship. We kicked off this research partnership last year to generate data on LGBTI people in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I guess to pull that all together, it's getting serious about the lack of funding, tapping the private sector, and looking at how we can do this in the long term with more diverse organizations and parts of society that have not been there so far.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. I learned a lot. Thank you to Taehyun and ICRW for hosting us, and there's some cookies back here.
I know, right?
So it's step away. Because they want to
Yes.
Yeah.
Robin?